I'm delighted to be able to address you today at the Anglicans for Life Summit. I believe this is my second time, but due to COVID, I'm having to address you remote, although I would much rather be with you in person. My task today is to speak to you about the area of infertility and assisted reproduction technology. Raising the question, is modern assisted reproductive technology our solution to infertility? I've spent the last 20 years of my career working in this space as a pediatric nurse and somebody who's deeply concerned about medicine and science and technology, but more importantly, the ethics of all this. As we say, just because you can do something, does that mean you should? So in the case of infertility, just because we have modern assisted reproductive technology available to us, should we use it? And if so, or if not, why or why not? Infertility is defined as the inability to conceive after 1 year of unprotected sexual intercourse. There are also other instances of problems with fertility where, for example, a woman might be able to achieve a pregnancy, but is unable to carry that pregnancy to term for many reasons. She just miscarries. So that would also be an area not of infertility, but problems with fertility in carrying a pregnancy to term. Infertility has actually been with us since the very beginning of time, but what is new are these new novel assisted reproductive technologies. They are a 20th century discovery, beginning with the birth of Louise Brown, who was born in 1978 in the United Kingdom. She was what they called the first test tube baby. So for the first time in 1978, after many, many decades of trial and error, Louise Brown was born. We were able to take Mrs. Brown's eggs out of her body, Mr. Brown's sperm out of his body, create embryos in the laboratory, then transfer the embryo back into Mrs. Brown, in this case's uterus, and voila, Louise Brown was born. But how do we, as Christians, how does our worldview influence our understanding of these technologies, and what, if any, of these are permitted? Why or why not? Let's start at the beginning, where in Genesis we read, I think it's really interesting, in the very first Bible, very first book of the Bible, we see the first story account of infertility. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and she said unto Jacob, to give me children, or else I will die. This is Genesis chapter 30. We recall the childhood song. I used to sing it when I jump roped. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes Rachel and Jacob with the baby carriage. But what happens when there is no baby carriage? There's love, there's marriage, there's a wanted child, but there is no baby carriage. There is real grief and sadness when a diagnosis of infertility is made. Some liken it to actual, a real grieving, a loss, like a death. In the first account of the barren womb, we also read still in Genesis, the Bible story of Sarai, Abraham, and Hagar. Let me briefly recount that story. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, Hagar, gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarai. Then Sarai said to Abram, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, and so she fled from her. One has to wonder, at least I wonder, if infertility has been with us since the beginning, since the early Bible accounts in the book of Genesis, and if issues like surrogacy and its aftermath, its negative aftermath, is spoken in the Bible so explicitly, why is it that Christians, in my mind, seem to be woefully uninformed on the ethics of assisted reproduction in general, and specifically the use of in vitro fertilization, egg donation, sperm donation, and even surrogacy? Perhaps it's because we don't speak of or teach of the barren womb in light of these modern technologies. When was the last time you heard a sermon preached on God's purposes for the barren womb or infertility? Our churches typically have annual celebrations around Mother's Day and Father's Day. I know many infertile couples who actually avoid those Sundays and don't even go to church on those days because it's so sad. Every infant dedication or baptism is a major church festivity. But what about those who desire or who long for children, yet are unable to conceive and bear an infant? What's our response to them? We are told in scripture that children are gifts from God. They are a reward. They are a blessing. Children are fearfully and wonderfully made by God, knit together by him in their mother's womb. Children are made by God. They are begotten by human beings. In the Roman Catholic tradition, the sacrament of marriage has a goal of producing children, allowing both the husband and the wife to participate in the begetting process as co-creators with God. It is the Lord in his sovereignty and in his omniscience who opens and closes the womb, we learn in 1 Samuel. Today we hear about the right to a child. No one has a right to a child. The account of Sarai shows what happens when we take matters into our own hands, taking what we think we are entitled to. No one has a right to any blessing or reward from God. If we had a right to them, they wouldn't be blessings, they wouldn't be gifts, they wouldn't be rewards, they would be things we are entitled to. While Rachel rightly cried out to God to give her children, and we should take our desires of our heart to God, and she prayed for what she desired, she was misguided in envying her sister who was able to have children. Of course, few people struggling with infertility approach it with the idea that God owes them a child in the forefront of their mind. However, what I've seen over and over in my work are actions and attitudes that seem as if implicitly they are owed a child because they want one. And that if that child doesn't come naturally, the use of these new technologies is uncritically accepted. The justification I often hear is that God has given us these new technologies, therefore we are permitted to benefit from them and to use them. How are we to view the possible use of assisted reproduction in light of the biblical truth that it is the Lord who opens and closes the womb? What about third-party assistance through egg donation or sperm donation or surrogacy? And I say donation in quote because we know that this is a very big commercial enterprise in the United States as well as around the world. I suggest that we look toward a medical model of healing and restoring fertility if and when possible. Isn't it Jesus who was the great physician? This differs from circumventing infertility or bypassing infertility through technological means. To state it another way, we cross a bright ethical line when we remove egg and sperm from the body. We move from procreation and toward becoming technological manufacturers rather than begetters or co-creators with God. As one ethicist has pointed out, there are now 38 ways to make a baby through modern assisted reproductive technology. Many, if not most of those involve taking egg and sperm out of the body and moving reproduction, procreation into the laboratory. And certainly all forms of third-party reproduction that do not involve adulterous sex involves making new life outside the human body. In addition, assisted reproductive technology via IVF, in vitro fertilization, creating embryos in the lab, is in no way a pro-life approach. This is Anglicans for Life I'm addressing, actually. And if you're concerned for all human life at any stage in development, we know that the loss of embryos from IVF is but one very real concern for Christians who oppose the taking of human life. In fact, the most recent data that we have from the Centers for Disease Control show that over 91,000 IVF cycles were done in the United States. But of those 91,000 cycles that were started, only 59,000 embryos were actually transferred into a woman's womb. Of those 59,000 embryos that were alive, living human embryos that were transferred, about 27,000 resulted in a positive pregnancy test, but only about 22,000 ended in a live birth. So from beginning of 91,000 cycles, we ended up with 22,000 roughly babies being born. Since the majority of IVF cycles fail, the practice is always to create many human embryos and freeze the surplus ones for later attempts, since the goal is a take-home baby. In the United States alone, we have approximately 1 million frozen human embryos. Only recently, I read in the news of a woman who gave birth using a frozen embryo. She was actually younger than the number of years that human embryo was frozen. This is, in my mind, very far from a pro-life position. In a nutshell, the issue here is that this moves the procreation of children from the domain of begetting to the domain of human making, producing, manufacturing of children. In fact, we no longer even speak of procreation, but of reproduction. When you think of reproduction, it's just making copies, it's manufacturing, which sounds mechanistic and carries at least a hint of human engineering and designing. I could speak at length about the consequences that flow from the making of human life in the laboratory, but I want to suggest that there's something deeply more important to be considered here, namely God's intention for children to come into the world through the physical uniting of a man and a woman. This is a deep issue to which most people have given far too little consideration, but somehow, your great Anglican priest and academic Oliver O'Donovan writes, when procreation is divorced from its context in the man-woman relationship, it becomes a project of marriage rather than its intrinsic good. The means to procreation become the instrumental means chosen by the will rather than themselves being the goods of marriage. I love how he says it becomes a project. Similarly, C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man warns of the power of man to make himself what he pleases, and the power of some men to make other men or our children what they please. The late Christian ethicist Paul Ramsey of Princeton goes even further with his condemnation of the use of in vitro fertilization, stating, I must judge that in vitro fertilization constitutes unethical medical experimentation on possible future human beings without their consent, and therefore it is subject to absolute moral prohibition. Think about that. The human embryo cannot consent to being manufactured, to being put in the freezer for 10 or 20 years. For couples facing infertility, roughly 1/3 of the infertility is due to issues with the woman's body. 1/3 of the infertility can be due to issues within the man's body. And then the final 1/3 of infertility is usually classified as infertility of unknown causes, which means we've done every test known to man, and we cannot understand why this couple, who seems quite healthy, cannot reproduce. But still, there are many things that I think, in my mind, ethically can be done to assist a husband and wife to achieve conception apart from assisted reproductive technology. Low-dose hormone therapy might be appropriate for women who are struggling with regulation of their ovulation or to help with hormone levels in both men and women. You've heard about low T. Treating blocked fallopian tubes is an ethical treatment back to the healing, curative, restorative model. Low-dose laser for endometriosis, just trying to track and time ovulation. Most people are really unaware of when they're actually fertile and can get pregnant. Other lifestyle factors often come into play. Healthy eating, maintaining a healthy weight. Most people don't realize being overweight has a negative impact on your fertility. Stop smoking if you smoke. Smoking negatively impacts fertility, as well as alcohol consumption. Age is often a factor. Many people today are postponing childbirth. They're, trying to buy a house or advance their career or complete a graduate or a PhD program. And the biological clock is very real, especially for women. Perhaps too, we need to reorient our thinking about what a family really is. God said that it was not good for Adam to be alone in the garden. And so he created Eve. Adam and Eve were a complete family unit in the garden. And there were no children in the garden when God pronounced his creation as very good. So I often remind couples who are struggling with infertility that they are a complete family unit. And God said it is very good. God's blessings come to us in many forms, and that form is not always in children. Sometimes we are called to direct our desires to nurture the next generation in other ways. I'm not aware of any church that has too many volunteers for the nursery or other children's activities. Many older adults, single and married, find themselves lonely and would be greatly ministered to by a visit, a call, a card, being adopted by a couple who can't conceive. The point is that perhaps some of us are called to a broader vision of what it means to nurture and to care and to parent. In closing, the pain of infertility is real and it cuts deep. In no way do I diminish it. However, as with all desires, there are limits to what we may and may not pursue in meeting those desires. Moving egg and sperm into the lab crosses in my mind an ethical line, changing procreation to technological making. All Christians would do well to think harder about ethical options available for treating infertility and about other options in situations where infertility cannot be overcome. When the baby carriage doesn't come for those we love, we need to be prepared to minister to those for whom God has something else planned. When the baby carriage doesn't come for ourselves, we need to seek to discover what other blessings God will pour out on us. I'm often asked about naprotechnology, and there's different methods, and you can, research on that. And I always tell couples when they're struggling with infertility to seek out a qualified physician in your community that is trained in naprotechnology, because I think these doctors are going to give you, they're going to give you a very good physical exam, and they're going to give you a very good diagnosis of what you're dealing with as far as your issue of infertility. As I said earlier, it could be something with just your cycle as a woman needs to be regulated, or you need to better understand when you are ovulating or if you're ovulating, so you know when you're going to be fertile, so you be sure to time your intercourse to happen in those kind of moments. So I think a naprotechnology doctor is going to give you a very good diagnosis, so you know what you're working with. I don't necessarily say that's the case if you go to your regular old OBGYN doctor, and I don't want to discredit them, but a lot of my experience is that they are going to push you more quickly to go the IVF route. They're going to say you need to go see a fertility specialist. And I'm a little bit cynical about fertility specialists because it's a very lucrative area of medicine. And I've spoken to many women who've gone the IVF route, and they've sunk hundreds of thousands of dollars and not ever been able to achieve a pregnancy. So I think it's really important to just have a very good diagnosis so you know what you're working with. And then these naprotechnology physicians can then advise you, and they're not going to advise you to do things that are, in my mind, unethical.